I took it maybe 10 years ago and this time I am an INFJ. And that's interesting to me because I've known I've been an introvert all my life. Even though I love to speak and teach, I definitely get more energy from being by myself after I speak. I need to catch up again in a certain sense. The intuition side, I think that shifted. I think it was more like sensory before, and now I'm more intuitive, feeling, and judging has been there all along. I love to have things pre-planned in terms of what I'm doing. My sister is the opposite. She wants to know nothing about what's happening and go off on a trip totally spontaneously. That doesn't work for me.
No, I'm a big time J, so I totally understand that. But on
that one, I was completely J. There was nothing else on the other side. I thought that was so humorous that I was very pegged over to one side.
Yes. A lot of people that are in the book are P's. So I thought, well, how can you go through graduate school or med school and be so open option? But I guess, this isn't the only factor in their personality, and the P allows for open options. So they don't have to follow the rule book in terms of this is the scientific model that we're all using.
Yes.
So that was interesting. And your birth order?
My birth order, I'm the second child. So my sister is the big sister, and so she has been, between the two of us, the one that was the boss of the two of us in terms of taking care of me when I was a little kid. And in her own way, she's the one that introduced me to meditation. So I really appreciate that she is the one that brought me from my materialist scientist perspective to take that first meditation intensive that really shifted my life. So I appreciate her spontaneity that allowed her to try that and then introduce me to it.
Interesting. The reason I'm asking that is a researcher said that rebel scientists, he called them, tended to be later born because they don't have to conform in the way that the firstborn does. No. But I don't think, I'll just have to do percentages when I have everybody in. But so far, there's a lot of firstborns too.
Yeah. Right.
So we'll see. Yeah. So what was there about your family growing up that led you to be a good student and to go to university and become a scientist?
I will answer that as soon as I tell you what my Enneagram type is, and then we will go back to that. But my Enneagram type is a 3.
Yeah.
Which is, I'm a very strong 3. And as soon as I read all the different Enneagram types, it was no question that I was a 3. And that governs my life for better or worse. And I say that because on the one hand, it's really allowed me to be very successful in the university, being a teacher and a scientist and giving talks and getting grants, things like that, because I love creating new projects. And the downside is that they say that 3s aren't as good at giving time to relationships and learning who they really are because they're so busy doing. And so I think in the last few years, I've been aware of that and trying to back off a little bit on the doing so that I can spend more time knowing who I am and how I fit into this universe. So I think it's been interesting to learn about those types and then see how I can be perhaps a little more balanced.
Right. It's not clear if I'm a 3 or a 1. So I identify with that achiever kind of go. Your childhood.
Yeah, so my childhood. Yeah, so, what I realized, I included this in my book as well, when I was 4 or 5 years of age, I remember very vividly this moment where living on a 1-acre mini farm with my family, my mother had killed a gopher that was putting tunnels through our front lawn, and she didn't like it, and so she had killed him with the back of a shovel, and he was lying there on the ground, and I had this incredible desire to know what was inside of that gopher, so I went inside and got a little kitchen knife, and then, my sister reminds me, she was there too, that we cut through the different parts of his skin so that I could look inside and see all of these interesting glistening organs that were going on inside of him that were there, and learning about what he really was inside. And I thought that was the first moment where my scientific career was beginning to show itself in terms of my inclinations. So that was an intriguing thing. And the other thing I noticed about my early childhood is I had a father who loved books, and he took me and my sister to the library every single Friday or Saturday night, and we would check out 5, 6, 7 books, and I had to actually learn to write my name when I was 4 to get a library card, which was the first time he took us to the library. And to me, the library was this amazing place of discovery. And I was so excited every week to go and get more books and read more things. So I realized that that was a really wonderful, nourishing way of helping me learn about the world.
And there was a small farm in Long Beach?
Well, when you say, so 1 acre is very mini. So basically my parents, it was right after the war, born in 1946, and they decided that they wanted to go back to the country living as much as they could within living in sort of a suburban environment. So they found a small area where they had 1 acre parcels, and on it they had like corn stalks in the front, a big vegetable garden. We had some 2 goats. We ended up having a cow at some point, some rabbits, some chickens, and I was in heaven. So that was, so here we are in the middle of Southern California, living that sort of life, which was wonderful.
You couldn't do that in Long Beach now.
No, not at all.
Unless you were a billionaire.
That's right. And I also recall, like, there would be moments during the summer when I was on the farm. I would be like underneath the corn stalks in the portion of the garden that had all of the corn, and like looking up through the corn stalks that were sort of almost like a pretty like chartreuse in color, looking up at the blue sky and just feeling the magic and the mystery of the world around me. And I think that I carried that into school, so that I had this wonderful time in school discovering languages, discovering science, discovering, all aspects of literature, et cetera, in my coursework. And so I always felt that school was a privilege and a joy rather than feeling it was like something that you had to do as a child. So I think that also probably influenced things as well. And I was also recalling there was this moment when I was 12 years old. I was in the 8th grade, and I was taking a science class. And we were studying this particular set of topics about how substances change form when they change temperature. And we were looking at ice, and we had read this page in our little textbook that said, when ice gets up to 32 degrees, then there is this transformation while it's sitting at 32 degrees where it goes from solid form to liquid form, and then it goes up gradually to 212, and then once again there's this shift, and it goes from liquid to gas, etc. And our teacher said, okay, now I want you to write a description of exactly what happens in these changes in state. And so I wrote my short, 2-paragraph essay or something like that, and we handed it in. And after he sat there and read them, he took me outside the classroom. And he said to me, Marjorie, he said, you are amazing in terms of your clarity and your detail about what you're studying, and I think you may really have scientific inclinations. And I think I was shocked and a little bit appalled by that, because it seemed so straightforward what I was talking about as a 12-year-old. And I thought, how could this say anything about being a scientist? But I was impressed that he took the time to tell me that, to encourage me to go on in my science.
That's huge.
Yeah.
And then did you go to USC as an undergrad?
Well, so here's the interesting thing about my life. All this time, from the time I was 7, I was also taking music in school and private lessons, and playing in our elementary school orchestra, then our junior high youth orchestra, and then in our civic symphony in our town. And I also loved my music, and people said I played first the flute and then the oboe. And they said, really, Marjorie, you should go on and play music because you are good at it. So I decided to first go to get a music major and then go on in science. And so actually my first 2 years were at the University of Redlands in their music department. Then I transferred for junior and senior years to USC because they had a much larger music department and much more skilled performers and professionals that were working with me. But then at the end of those 4 years of being a music major, I realized I could never be competitive in the way you have to be competitive at the very top of the performance level in music compared to being a professor and a researcher in neuroscience, because there's no real room at the top in music. I would probably be an orchestra teacher in a high school or something like that, or a private teacher, but I wouldn't be really a great musician. I wasn't that good. And so that's when I then went on, took 1 extra year of classes in all of the sciences and biology that I needed to get into graduate school in neuroscience, and then went on to my neuroscience career. And I never regret that, because I love music. I love the oboe. I love Bach and Beethoven, and I can appreciate them more now because I had that musical background.
Absolutely. And then why did you pick neuroscience?
That's because I had the most wonderful professor when I was a junior in high school, in English. In fact, it was American literature. And we started out the first few weeks of the fall in American literature, and they said, wait a minute, you guys need to understand the basics before you can understand American literature. And I'm going to take you way back to the Greeks and to Socrates and Plato, and I'm going to work you forward so that you can see where American literature came from. And he also introduced us to William James at that time,
Wow.
which is really the father of modern psychology, and William James' writings like The Varieties of Religious Experience. And I was struck by William James and what he had to say about the mind. And when I read William James, I said, that's what I want to do. I want to understand the human mind. And, as a child, I wondered if there was a soul, because my parents had taken me to church, and I didn't really resonate with what I was learning in our church, but I had that sense that maybe there could be a soul. And I thought, well, if there were a soul, maybe it would lie somewhere within the brain, or it would be interconnected with the brain. So maybe as a youngster, I thought that would be a place to look. So there were a lot of reasons to actually begin to explore the mystery of the brain. And so that's where I went on into college and then graduate school.
And then why not psychology? Why the more biology aspect of it?
So this is a very humorous story. So in my first year of college, I took a psychology course, general psychology, and I did reasonably well. And then my second course on psychology was called Psychological Theories of Personality. And as soon as we started that course, I actually felt a real strong dislike for it, because it seemed like it was all fluff. It was people's ideas about personality, and I didn't see the strong scientific evidence for different types of personality. And after I took that course, I took a biology course, and in that course we were studying neurons, and it was like, oh, neurons. It's like, I understand neurons. And that's really what caused that shift. And I went straight from psychology then into neurophysiology, and luckily found that later on neuroscience and psychology began to really merge in terms of the research they were doing, and psychologists were really looking at aspects of brain function and physiology, as well as neuroscientists really looking at what I would call behavior and trying to understand behavior from that perspective. So I think now they're really melding the two. At that time, they were much more separate.
Mm-hmm. And then what kind of church did your parents take you to when you were growing up?
It was a fundamentalist Protestant church. It was a Baptist church. And I also remember when I went to those first 2 years at the University of Redlands, it was also part of the American Baptist Convention. And I came home from my first religion class, because they required you to take it at a college like that. And my religion professor was very, very liberal. And he said, well, a lot of those stories from the Bible we're supposed to interpret symbolically. And it doesn't mean that they really happened. And I was telling my parents all of these new things I was learning very excitedly. And my mother said, oh, no. And she wrote to the American Baptist Convention, and she said, do you know what they're teaching those children in that college? And I should say that it was at that point, with my biology background and my new perspective, I would say, on religion and the background, that perhaps it could be interpreted symbolically rather than absolutely literally, that I, for a while, really went to becoming an atheist, like all of my neuroscience professors, saying, it's a material reality, this is the basis for my own consciousness. And it took me a long time, in fact, until I had my first meditation experience, to really shift from that more materialistic framework on the world.
And when was that your sister introduced you to meditation?
That was basically in 1976. So I was now at I was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Oregon doing research in the neuroscience program, had just left there, and was now about to become a professor at a university in Virginia. And in the summertime, it was my birthday, August 25th, and she said, I am studying with a meditation master from India at a meditation ashram in the Catskill Mountains of New York, and it's your birthday coming up. I would like you to come and visit me, and I'll give you a gift of a meditation retreat. And I was skeptical, but I was also curious. She had told me a little bit about it the previous Christmas when we were down at my parents' in Sedona together, and I had had an experience that made me think that meditation was more than just something esoteric. So when I then took that meditation retreat that weekend, I had the most amazing experience that I wrote about in my book, where what happened was that the Swami Muktananda, came around, and we were told that he was going to be initiating every person in the room in that first morning meditation. And we were told it was going to be happening through the Swami's touch. And the scientist in me was skeptical, but I was also there, and I decided to put the skepticism aside for the weekend and just experience it. And so when he came, and my eyes were closed, my senses were otherwise, though, fully engaged. So when I felt his thumb and his fingers right between my eyes and on the bridge of my nose, and felt what seemed like a current of electricity going from his fingers down to the center of my chest, I had the sense of utter certainty about that experience. And it felt like that energy stopped right in the center of my chest, right at the point of my heart. Not the physical heart, but more like a heart than the physical heart ever seemed, and then began radiating outward with this feeling of like love and joy, like a nectar that I had never experienced before. And I'm thinking, what is this? And who are you, and what have you given me? I mean, I was just amazed at that experience. And I recall going back home to my university position in Virginia, getting up the next morning, and at 5 a.m. spontaneously got up to meditate. And I've been doing that every single day since then, because I knew at that point that there was this ecstasy that was simmering underneath my ordinary awareness, and I just had to go inside to meditate, and I could begin to capture that again. So it was like one of those wonderful things that I was curious and open enough to say yes to my sister's invitation, and then had that wonderful experience. That at that point I went from being a materialist neuroscience who thought my sister was a slightly esoteric, new age hippie in a certain sense, to now saying, wow, this is real. I don't understand it, but there's something going on here. So,
do you use a mantra, or do you use something to focus on when you meditate?
Yes, I do. And there are different mantras that I have used. I mean, one is Om Namah Shivaya, which is very standard in India, which means I honor my highest self. And that was one of the first ones I used. Another one that I use a lot now, again, is quite universal, and that is the sound of the breath. And in India, they say it's, for example, Hamsa or Soham. And just listening to the breath and seeing if you can hear that sound in the breath is that way of focusing. And I think that's one that's probably universal across many, many, many traditions. And that's very powerful in quieting the mind down. So yes,
because we're all breathing, so it is a universal method.
Yes.
Yeah. And then at the University of Virginia, were you in touch with the Ian Stephen legacy people in the perceptual studies? Did you know their work?
No, so that's an interesting point. I wasn't at the University of Virginia. I was at VPI and SU, or Virginia Polytechnic, which was in Blacksburg, Virginia, so a little further south and toward the west. But I didn't know anyone of that sort then, because at that point I had just had my first introduction into meditation, and I was still with almost my blinders on doing my neuroscience research and teaching at that particular point in time. So it was really only when I started, after I went back to get my master's degree in Asian Studies while I was at the University of Oregon and began writing the book, Infinite Awareness, that I began actually opening myself up to looking at research into mystical phenomena. And that's when I discovered Ian Stevenson's research. And I mentioned in my book that I was shocked when I first read his studies on reincarnation, because even though I'd been meditating for maybe 25 or more years, when I was beginning to do this research on the book and doing my research for my Asian Studies degree, I had always considered reincarnation subjects way out there, because that was beyond what a biologist could actually accept. When you hear the word reincarnation as a biologist, you say, excuse me, we're not going there. But then when I read his studies, they were so carefully done, and they had such compelling evidence. I finally had to say, well, how can I ignore this? If I'm going to accept that this is a carefully done study, and he shows all the ways he has carefully investigated this, I have to say that there's more to reincarnation than I originally thought. And that's when I began to change. So I'm so happy that he was one of those first professors in a psychiatry department that was actually interested in doing research on reincarnation, because he felt this could explain personality development in many children if they were still holding on to these past life experiences. And it's like, wow, interesting. So yes, I was absolutely amazed when I looked at some of those carefully done studies. So that's when I first heard about him. And then in my book, I mentioned that when my own book was about almost ready to be finished, I had read this wonderful book, Irreducible Mind, that was edited by Ed Kelly at the University of Virginia and his group that's there in the Division of Perceptual Studies. And the humor is that my husband had actually originally ordered that book because we heard about it when we were reading Eben Alexander's book, which was Proof of Heaven. And at the end, he says he got to know Ed Kelly at the University of Virginia, and they really taught him a lot about understanding what the mind really is about and the connection between the mind and the brain. So my husband Paul bought the book, and when it arrived, it was 800 plus pages. And he just like opened it up and said, "Oh my God, this is not for me." And he put it over on my desk. And I let it sit there for about 6 months because I was doing other things. And then finally, I opened it up to the first pages. And when I started reading Ed Kelly's introduction as a neuroscientist now, hearing information from a fellow neuroscientist, he was describing every single theory of neuroscience that I had been introduced to from the time I was a young graduate student and that I was steeped in, but they never really truly explained the mind and the brain interconnections. And he showed the weaknesses of each one of these theories. And then he goes on in the rest of the 800 pages of the book to show you all the research that shows that, in fact, consciousness cannot be reduced to the activity of the neurons in the brain. And so I kept, as I was reading every one of those 800 pages, I would stop and I would like poke my husband and say, "You can't believe it, what I just read." And then I would share with him the next thing that Ed Kelly actually wrote. And so that's when I heard about their lab. And then having read that book, I wrote to Ed Kelly by email, and I simply said, I've read your book. I'm ready to write my last chapter where I'm trying to pull everything together on the mind and the brain and their interactions. And is there any way I might be able to come and talk to you and your laboratory, the people in your laboratory? And I was amazed because he didn't act like the normal neuroscientist in that he wrote back immediately and said, "Absolutely, yes. It would be wonderful to host you. Let's find a time when everybody is in the laboratory so you can meet all of them." And we set up a time for a few months later, and they welcomed me with this refreshing interest in my own research and sharing their research with me. And so then, in fact, I added an extra chapter to the book just about their own experiences of doing research in this area and also their own mystical experiences that perhaps compelled them impelled them forward in doing this type of research, which is always fascinating how, as you're doing right now with your interviews, finding out how who we are and our research actually inform each other. So,
you're saying
so that was...
Some of them had transcended experiences personally.
Right, and yes, and so in my book I talk about Ed Kelly's own experiences when he was a graduate student at Harvard University in psychology, where they are materialists. I mean, they are behaviorists. They do not believe. And yet he said, I guess what happened is his mother called him up one day and said that a relative of his was actually acting right now in a small religious Protestant group as a medium and letting these spirits talk through her in these, monthly sessions. And his mother was a little worried, and she said, "Would you check this out?" And so he said, "Sure, Mom." And he actually went up in William James Hall to the library where all of this work by William James is on parapsychology and things like mediums. And he read, and that was his first time that he really knew that William James was interested in these paranormal, if we want to call them that, phenomena. And then as he read, he said, what the relative was doing was really benign. It was fine. He let his mom know. But he was also then introduced to that. And then he said when I think a young Swami from, I think the Vivekananda tradition was coming to Harvard to give a talk, the department secretary asked him if he wanted to come. He ended up saying, "Oh yeah, I don't have anything to do." And he went there. It's the Vedanta Society. That's what it is. And he said this man was a very short of stature, small-ish man, and yet he had the most powerful presence. And he said it really struck him, and the room was absolutely packed full of people. And after that, he went to the Vedanta Society's bookstore in Back Bay in Boston, got some of the books and began meditating. And then he began having his own experiences. And that finally led him to, after his Ph.D. was finished, go down to work at the Rhine Institute at Duke University on parapsychology. So literally, I could see how his own experiences influenced his own research as well.
It's been very frustrating for me because none of them, Grayson, Kelly, will be interviewed for this book. So,
yes, I mean, that is sad because I think they would have a lot to say. And I know
yeah.
that Bruce Grayson is writing his own book that should be published within the year, which probably will have a lot of that information in it. So at least it will probably will be available. And I think I certainly tell much of Ed Kelly's story in my book. And he reminds me that he has other articles that describe a lot of that time in his life and those influences. So yes, but I am sad that they won't also be part of my book. Yes.
I am. Why did you decide to do a master's in Asian studies? Because of the meditation experiences?
It was what was happening is that I was now at the University of Oregon. And so during the day, I would be in my laboratory doing research on rehabilitation, neuroscience, talking to my students and colleagues about that. And then I would go to teach a class on Hatha yoga or meditation, or I would go to the meditation center and I would be having a whole different set of conversations. And it felt like I was leading two separate lives. And I wanted a way of really trying to put them together because I believed that they really could be fit together. So what happened is that I had my third sabbatical coming up, and I think this was after working at the university 21 years, and I said, this sabbatical, I can really do exactly what I want, and I can spend the whole sabbatical actually studying meditation-oriented topics, Eastern traditions, and Eastern philosophy at the University of Rochester, where they had a very strong Asian studies program there. So I asked if I could come for my sabbatical, and they said yes. And so I took Sanskrit so that I could begin to look at original texts in Sanskrit from these Asian traditions, and also a lot of their Asian studies programs on different texts and things like that. And that became the preparation for going back to the University of Oregon the next year and applying for a master's degree in Asian studies as I was continuing on all of my teaching and research in neuroscience. And that was a wonderful experience. I loved, first of all, seeing a whole different part of the university. So when you're in science, you have your blinders on and you just interact with other scientists. And when I was now back in this Asian studies program, I was interacting with these wonderful literature professors, history professors, etc., archaeology, anthropology, and I really had a whole new awakening in terms of education as to the other aspects of education that are out there. And that then triggered me to finish my master's thesis trying to talk about how neuroscience and Asian traditions might actually fit together. And then my professor, Mark Uno, who was a professor in Asian studies, religious studies, said to me at the end of my master's, he said, you really should turn this into a book. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And that's then what happened as I began to explore even further into things like reincarnation, near-death experiences, energy healing, to really understand consciousness from this broader perspective.
So specifically, how does neurobiology tie in with these kind of paranormal practices?
Well, I think the interesting thing is that if you're just a neurobiologist and you're just looking at what happens in the brain when you're meditating, all you can say is, well, I guess it can be all reduced to the brain because I can see that the brain changes. Now it's your prefrontal cortex that's active and not maybe the default mode network. And so they can perhaps, if they want to, try to make it sound like it's just a materialistic phenomenon. But when you go deeper into the research and you look, for example, at near-death experiences, then you find out that in these careful studies by Bruce Grayson, Kim van Lommel from the Netherlands, that they are doing prospective studies, which are the gold standards of research studies, where you start at a particular point in time and you bring into a network of hospitals everybody that has basically cardiac arrest. And their heart is stopped and they have a flat EEG. And then if they survive, you interview them and say, what happened? Were you able to actually observe anything during your resuscitation? And then in this case, something around like 12 to 15% said, oh yes, I could. And I saw these either other realms, or I actually saw the people resuscitating me, and they can identify the doctors and the nurses. And the point is that with flat EEG, with no heartbeat, often for like 2-4 minutes, etc., there's no way that this should be possible. And so when these careful MDs are doing this research, I, as a neuroscientist, can't say, oh, they must have made a mistake. I have to believe their careful research. And so to me, that's where you begin to say, look, this can't be a phenomenon purely of neural activity, because the neurons were flatlined in all of the perceptual parts of the cortex, which would allow the people to see the operating room. And of course, the other point is they're usually seeing the operating room from above their body. So there's no way you can explain that from a materialist point of view. So those were the first things that made me say, okay, it's not just the brain. But I also felt that there is something interesting about our fact that we use the brain for a lot of sensory perceptual experience during our lives. The brain is very useful. And I think what happened to me is as I began to read William James and Ed Kelly and many other people who have begun to thought about that, they're really saying that, to think about that what is happening is that our brain evolutionarily has been made to filter out most of the information that could be available to it because it would only confuse us in terms of being adaptive to living and surviving in the world around us. And so we have attentional filters that basically block out most everything. And in fact, most psychologists today know there are attentional filters and they accept that. But they don't think of them as attentional filters on something that might be like beyond the senses. They think of it only as taking filtering out sensory awareness. But when you consider that and you say then maybe when a person has a near-death experience, what happens is the filters all come off because the brain now is no longer functioning. Now they can see something much broader than their five senses. That seems to make a little bit more sense. So first I read the near-death experience research and I said, this really makes a lot of sense. And then I began to explore other meditation studies. And there's this one meditation study that came out, I think it's in like 2014 by, I think it's Theo Hinterberger and his colleagues from Regensburg, Germany. And they did a very interesting study where they compared people doing what they call thought-free meditation. So these are people that are well trained in meditation and they can really get down to that state where their thoughts are as flat as possible, just clear mind as possible. And they compared them in that state of meditation to mantra repetition or focused meditation. In effect, I think they were actually having them focusing on the point between their eyes. Another one where they were just monitoring sort of the environment around them quietly. And another one where their eyes were closed and they were simply resting with their eyes closed. And they showed that in the thought-free meditation, their EEG was lower by far than in any other one of those states, and it was across all the frequencies and the areas of the brain. So this includes, for example, alpha activity, beta activity, theta activity. All of these things were much, much lower than normal, which reminded me of how the brain goes toward flatline or does flatline in a near-death experience. So I thought, well, maybe there's a correlation between less brain activity and less filtering so that you can experience these things. Because they had mystical experiences, of course, in their meditation. And then just, I think, in the last 6 months, I also came across some interesting studies on psilocybin research that is being done now with people that are perhaps with cancer that is the end-stage cancer, and they want to help these people see a reality that is broader than what you might see with your five senses. And so they're under carefully controlled hospital conditions giving these people psilocybin. And a group in London, it's Robin Carhart Harris and his colleagues, have put these people during this psilocybin experience in a functional magnetic resonance imaging machine and shown that there is a direct correlation between the lessening activity in all the key hub areas of the brain in the fMRI and the correlation with the intensity of the mystical experience they're having under psilocybin. So once again, they were surprised. They said, this is really interesting that lowering brain activity is causing these experiences. It's not higher brain activity caused by the drug, it's lowering. So those three areas of research tell me that yes, our brain is very useful in this world, and it's probably filtering out a lot of important information that may relate to our mystical experiences and experience beyond just the confines of our body and our immediate environment. So I find that fascinating, and I'm hoping that more and more people in the neuroscience area will begin to look at this to see if we can find a little bit more about this filtering process and how reducing the filtering may actually enhance our experiences in these moments.
Has there any research about people with dissociative identity disorder? Because the alters are so different. You know, one can have this disease and the other alter doesn't. So has there been research how their brain reflects those switches?
Well, so I'm smiling right now because you're reminding me about a recent article that, in fact, Ed Kelly co-authored with another scientist, and I'll think of his name in a moment, where they actually were talking about those sorts of disorders. But they said that actually this is a beautiful example of the phenomenon of the creation of beings within this world, that if there is one consciousness and it then, in terms of creating reality, basically separates itself out into all of these different minds, what we have is, in a certain sense, a dissociative identity disorder, that we all think we are different. But in fact, we are one consciousness. And when we have that mystical experience, we realize, oh my goodness, all along, I have been interconnected with all of these other personalities, and in our essence, we are the same. And so they used that argument, and I thought it was a beautiful argument, because that's the experience in a mystical phenomenon. The person has a sense of, oh yes, I am actually one with everyone else in this world. So I think that's interesting, and it's interesting too that sometimes when people do have the dissociative identity disorder, when they do come back then to that one personality, I imagine they have again a sense of coherence, though I haven't really looked carefully at all that research.
But it would be interesting to know what changes physiologically with altered change, because if one doesn't have the disease, then we need to know what's going on physiological, that they don't have diabetes or whatever it is.
And I'm sure there's research out there, and I imagine that Ed Kelly would probably be able to actually tell me about that if I were to ask him, but I just don't know it myself. Very interesting.
Let me ask you this before we go into your research with healing modalities. What have been the most difficult challenges in your life, and how did you cope? I think that's useful for other people to know.
Yeah, and I thought that was an interesting question for you to ask me. And when I thought about it, I was sort of searching through, difficult moments perhaps in my career or something like that. And what I realized after doing that is that really the most challenging aspect for me in my life has really been, as a student now of what I would call a spiritual tradition, where I am focusing on staying in the present moment and being able to deal with any challenge in a place of equanimity, where I don't allow myself to react to it and get pulled off balance. That has been one of the most amazing challenges of my life. And also to begin to embody virtues, like the virtue of kindness, the virtue of generosity. And when I say embodying it, I realize that in most traditions, we understand that kindness is important, we understand that generosity is important, and our mind understands it. But then in a given situation, we can't embody it at that moment. We can't live it in the moment. And I'm realizing that that's one of those goals that I have had. And I'm learning finally that this is, I think, the humor for every human being, that when I am generous, I actually feel inside a lot better than when I am being less generous and I'm wanting something for myself. And in fact, it feels a lot better as a human being when we actually learn to embody, to live the virtues. So I think that has been one of those things. And also to not just have my spiritual practice, like meditation, be something that I do for 45 minutes or an hour in the morning, but see how I can actually keep that sense of presence throughout my day so that I can stay aware of my sense of connection with the people around me, with the world around me. So a big challenge. I've been practicing at it for more than 40 years now, and little by little we move forward. But it's also very gratifying when you begin to see that you are moving forward.
What about having children? That can be a big challenge.
You're right. And so my husband and I have never had any children. So I think that that's perhaps why I don't have those other challenges in my life. Because you're right, many of my very good friends say that raising children has been a real challenge because you have expectations of your own, and the children don't necessarily follow your expectations.
That's so true. And then what about, as you've moved around, your husband has been able to move too?
Well, in fact, I did not meet that's another interesting thing. I didn't meet my husband until I came to the University of Oregon. So that made it easy. And then I stayed at the University of Oregon for the rest of my career. And so I think you asked another question at some point about whether I've had any sort of paranormal phenomena or downloadings or synchronicities or things like that. And my first answer would be, well, on the surface of it, not like some people do that perhaps have had amazing experiences of other realms or something. But here's an interesting one that relates to my husband, and that is that during one of my sabbaticals, I was able to spend a portion of it after doing my research at a university in France and a university in Sweden. I was able to spend some time with my own meditation teacher as she was traveling. And we happened to end up the year in the summer in the Catskill Mountains of New York. Her name is Gurumai. And what happened is that at the very end of the summer, before I was going to be leaving to go back home to the University of Oregon, she came into the office where I was working that day, and she said, Marjorie, she said, are you getting married? And I said, no, Gurumai. I have no intention of getting married because it would be so difficult to lead the life I'm living. Being able to spend time on my sabbatical doing this with you and also going off to do these other things. And so she didn't say any more, and she talked to someone else. And so I then left and went home a few days later. And I swear within like 2 weeks, I get a phone call from a man who has heard about my own tradition. And he then says to me, well, I'm really intrigued by it. I heard this program on National Public Radio by Joseph Chilton Pearce, where he talks about this meditation. And I'm a little skeptical, but I'm intrigued. And I said, hey, I'm just an ordinary University of Oregon neuroscience professor, nothing unusual about me. And I have a meditation center in my home. So, come, on one of the Thursday nights. So he walks in the next Thursday night. And when he walks in the door, I have the sense that we're going to get married. Oh. Now, I don't say a thing to him. That would be totally inappropriate. Yeah. But I do then smile when about 7 weeks later he stays after everybody else has left at the program, and he says, I have something to confess to you. And I say, well, what? And he said, I'm incredibly attracted to you. Oh. And I burst out laughing, and I said, it took you long enough. And we were married the next year. So, oh. He was a professor at a community college in literature, and I was then a professor in neuroscience. And so it worked out very well for our careers to be able to do this. And it's been wonderful having a husband who was interested in meditation as well. It's very supportive.
Oh, yes. That's fabulous. So you've written over 180 research articles in neuroscience about balance, motor control, development, but you also wrote about sensory contributions to music performance. What does that mean?
Well, what it means is that at a certain point in your career as a neuroscientist, you have tenure, you're a professor, and you've done plenty of research in your primary area. In my case, it was rehabilitation, balance control, stroke, Parkinson's disease, etc. And now I felt that I could, if I wanted to, look at other things that were of interest to me, but which would be harder to get grant support for. And one of those was music, because I had been a musician all of my life. And I was intrigued by what makes a musician a really great musician in terms of their sensory perceptual abilities and their motor abilities, since I was studying sensation and motoric abilities. And so I had a student that was interested in this as well, and I had just taken up the cello. And so with my cello professor at the university and my graduate student, we performed a study on all of his students to find out what it was that seemed to be the mark of somebody that was a really, really great cello performance major. And of course, one of the things that it turned out to be was somebody that has a very keen ear to really be able to hear their intonation and to have attentional ability so that they can really be focused on how their music sounds as they're actually trying to create it. You have to be able to be focused on two things at once. And you have to be really a skilled performer to be able to be listening while you're actually performing. So that was one of the things that happened with the music. So I did that. I think I probably have maybe 5 papers or more in music from continuing that on, also with at the Max Planck Institute in Berlin, where I did more of that research with another postdoc that was there. So the joy of being a professor is that you get to study things that you find very interesting but aren't along like the main lines of what grants would necessarily fund.
Yes.
So that's the music portion of it. And then, of course, you might ask, well, then how did I get into the meditation? And I think that there it was, once again, that I had been doing my research in neuroscience for a good 25 years at the University of Oregon, and I'd been meditating, and I was leading these 2 lives. And it was at that point where I was beginning to think about getting that Asian Studies degree that I decided that I would bring in a few graduate students that were interested in things like meditation and Tai Chi and these other practices to try to see if we could learn something about how they affect the brain and our attentional systems. And so I began to do those types of research studies and found them incredibly fascinating for me, that finally I could try to understand a little bit more about how my brain might be changing as I meditate. And I think that here's an interesting point about meditation research. There's two types of meditation research. There's one, which is the type I tended to do at the University of Oregon, and which most other neuroscientists do. And I would put into this category one of the most famous neuroscientists in the other area, which is Dr. Richard Davidson at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He does very brilliant research related to emotional regulation and attention and meditation, and showing how it really improves our immune function, our attentional pathways, etc. But what he's really doing is he's calling meditation a mental training, and he is really showing the general community of the United States and other scientists that you don't have to think of this as a spiritual phenomenon or a mysterious, mystical phenomenon. This is a very down-to-earth, pragmatic tool that you can use to help children in the school system focus better, etc. There's a second type of research, which is saying, it's more like what Ed Kelly is doing in the near-death experience research of Bruce Grayson. It's really saying, that's all great, wonderful, and great. And we want to add one more thing. Is consciousness tied to the activity of neurons in the brain, or could consciousness be fundamental and still be present when the neurons in the brain are no longer active? Now, so far, I don't think Dr. Richard Davidson has gone there. That's just not where he's focused on. He's focused on something very different. But I think that there are a few more people interested in that. And I originally, like Richard Davidson, just focused on changes in the brain, which are great. I mean, I think one of the things that we showed was that when you practice Tai Chi for long-term periods or meditation for long-term periods, your attentional systems definitely get stronger. And you actually see changes in the brain in the anterior cingulate cortex area, in the brain right about here, also in prefrontal cortex areas. And these are associated with being much, much faster and more efficient at being able to stay present and focused when you're dealing with ever-changing situations in the laboratory. So I thought that was interesting, but that didn't really answer the questions I was interested in. So what's happened now is, since I've retired from this type of research at the university, I'm wanting to go more into the research areas, the avenues that, for example, Bruce Grayson has been interested in the past, and others. And these relate to things like, for example, not only near-death experiences, but also end-of-life experiences. I'm very much interested, for example, in terminal lucidity. And I'm not sure how much you're aware of that, but this is when a person has dementia or has had a stroke or has been in a coma for, it can be months, days, or years, and in the last minutes to hours of life, they come out, they're totally lucid, and they say goodbye to their family, and then they die. And neuroscientists say this is impossible. If their brain clearly was filled with the Alzheimer's plaques and other things associated with dementia, they should never become lucid before they die.
That's great.
And so one particular professor, Alexander Battiani from the University of Vienna in Austria, has been trying to collect data from MDs and nurses who have actually been dealing with these sorts of people over the years, to see if he can find out what they might have for observations. And he's begun a pilot on that. And some of the studies, the stories, the experiences that have been collected are amazing, about a grandmother calling up, who had been basically, I believe, demented for many, at least months, calling up her children and her daughter, and her grandchildren and her daughter, and saying goodbye to them, totally clear, cognitive, beautiful, and then dying the next day. Many other stories like that. So that's, and what Battiani talks about is the idea that maybe what's happening is that consciousness is beginning to peel itself away from the diseased brain in those last minutes to hours of life. And it's a little bit like the sun that's been in eclipse by the moon, and now being able to come back and show what was actually there in consciousness, but covered up by the disease of the brain.
That's a great image. I love that image.
I love that image. And of course, there's no data yet to show that, but it's a great way of beginning to look at these things and to say, could we actually have a very careful systematic study in hospices, in nursing homes, and other facilities where we do careful interviews with these people as they're moving toward those last hours of life and their families, and find out more about this? Because one thing that Battiani said that I thought was very critical is that when nurses and hospice care workers have these experiences with a dying patient, they suddenly saw that somebody with Alzheimer's was not just somebody that seemed like a vegetable. There was a living, conscious being inside that brain that couldn't get out. And they suddenly understood that they needed to respect that and treat this person as a very precious, sacred human being, even though that person couldn't communicate with them in the way they were used to.
That's profound.
Yeah.
In Infinite Awareness, The Awakening of a Scientific Mind, one of the things you talk about in terms of brain changes is right brain dominance seems to be more active in psi phenomena. Am I understanding that correctly?
Definitely right. And I think that partly why that actually became a predominant concept within our culture right now is because of Jill Bolte Taylor's book. That was My Stroke of Insight, where she talks about, as a neuroanatomist who understands the brain, noting that her stroke caused basically the right side of her brain, associated then with left-handedness, the right side of her brain to actually be the dominant part of her brain, because the rational, linear part of her brain was shut down due to the stroke. And she had these amazing experiences of unity awareness and other things of that sort. And she was a little discouraged as she began to recover from her stroke to realize it was harder to hold on to that, and she had to work to hold on to that. But if you look at psychology studies, they talk about the dominance of the two hemispheres of the brain and the fact that our language hemisphere can actually dominate so much that it keeps us from having these more gestalt, holistic experiences. So I think that that's an interesting point, that what we're doing in meditation perhaps is letting that dominant language, linear side of the brain become a little bit more quiescent, so that the more gestalt, holistic side of the brain can begin to come out and give us a whole different sense of what we're seeing and interpreting around us.
When I teach workshops on how to develop clairvoyance and healing abilities, and what I always say to them is keep the left brain busy by asking questions. Why am I seeing this? What does this mean? So it just keeps the left brain from shutting out. Oh no, this stuff doesn't work. It's not possible. And I wanted to ask you that I've seen studies that women tend to have more integration between the corpus callosum, so they're more kind of whole brain and less specialized. Is that accurate?
You know, I don't know that research specifically, so I can't say for sure, but I gather that because, I mean, if it has been published in a reputable journal, I would certainly believe it. And I think what's interesting as you say that is that for a long time, we were very afraid in neuroscience to talk about any differences in the brains between like males and females and things like that. And now we're learning that it doesn't mean that one is worse than the other. It just means that we are able to complement each other with our different abilities, where one of us might be a little bit better than the other. And I think what we tend to do when we hear some article like that is it's like, well, all women are this way and all men are that way. And of course, it's not that way at all. These are usually small but significant differences, and we have a bell-shaped curve with people being at different points along that bell-shaped curve. And I think we see that probably both within the female and the male population as well. My husband, by the way, is very artistically inclined and a photographer, and I think that he has a lot of those characteristics that I really appreciate, because as a woman, I also tend to have those characteristics too, and we can talk a little bit more to each other than if I had a husband that was into just football and sports and, you know, that sort of a thing. So I appreciate the fact that he might be a little more toward the center of the bell-shaped curve, so that we can actually talk to each other better.
Well, psychological studies like Sandra Bem show that androgynous people are more flexible and more healthy psychologically. So it makes sense. If you can access different possibilities, you have more available to you.
Right. And you're reminding me about sort of that Chinese symbol, the yin-yang symbol, and we all have the yin and the yang within us. And what we're really trying to do is actually balance those two within us as human beings. And that's a great way to look at it.
And Carl Jung talked about that in terms of we have to integrate, you and I are animus, and men, they're anima. So it's just another way of saying that, our job is to become whole. I'm interested in the studies you did of alternative and complementary medicine practices, Tai Chi, Reiki, meditation. aerobic exercise, hypnosis. What did you find was most impactful, most helpful?
Well, I think the first thing that struck me, and in fact, I start that section of my book about the placebo because actually neuroscientists strongly believe in the placebo effect. And in fact, every new drug that comes out has to have a placebo portion to the study to be sure that it's acting more than a placebo. And the humor that I find in that is that the neuroscientists are ignoring the power of the placebo in doing this. The fact that this could be a sugar pill. And when I looked at these carefully controlled studies on the placebo effect, I was absolutely like awestruck by it. So since I am a motor control neuroscientist and I know about Parkinson's disease and that we actually give Parkinson's patients L-DOPA, which turns into dopamine in the brain to help their movement, that a placebo could actually increase dopamine in the brain. And I'm going, this means that the mind of that patient is strong enough to imagine. And I think imagine is a word that it's not even the best word to use because we think imagine means it's not real. This is imagining so to make it real so that we make more dopamine in our brain and our Parkinson's symptoms actually decrease. So when I heard about that with Parkinson's disease, also with painkillers, that actually the placebo activates the various parts of the brain that are inhibiting the activation of the pain pathways, I'm going, this is amazing that my belief that I might be getting a painkiller, even though I'm getting a sugar pill, is enough to turn on inhibition of the pain pathways. So right there, I want to say to these neuroscientists, the mind is a lot more powerful than you think. You think it's the neurons that are doing this or the chemicals that are doing this. It is my belief system, which is beyond my brain, which is then affecting my brain and affecting my chemical pathways. So right there, yeah.
The amazing thing to me is that even if people know it's placebo,
yeah,
and especially if it's like a big colorful pill, it has more impact. And they know it's just a sugar pill, but it still is more impactful than not taking the placebo. That's amazing.
Yes. So I think, so that was the first thing. And then after knowing about that, then you take all these other studies, like, for example, energy healing. Let's take Reiki. And now what they're doing is they're comparing Reiki to the placebo, which already we know is powerful. And they're showing that Reiki is still more powerful than the placebo in many cases. I think one of the studies that I talk about is by Rachel Friedman, I believe is her name, from Yale University Medical School, where these were heart attack patients that they brought into the hospital, and they gave some of the heart attack patients Reiki healing for the first weeks after the heart attack. They gave others restful music because they knew that music is also good for improving our nervous system function afterwards. And then they had some people that just had bed rest, and they showed that the Reiki was better than the music and the bed rest, and it was equivalent to propranolol, which is the pharmaceutical usually given to these patients, in controlling their cardiac variability, which is the way we measure cardiac function. And so my sense was, my goodness, I am saying placebo already is a strong effect of my mind on my body, and now Reiki, this energy healing, is actually beyond that and as good as the pharmaceuticals, which the physicians would much rather give to people than the energy healing, because we have come to believe that the pharmaceutical, quote unquote, works, which is so humorous to me.
Yeah, and it's easy to measure. I'm giving you 2 milligrams of this, where it's hard to measure. I'm giving you this many Reiki beams of healing light. What do you know about Sham Reiki, where I'm asking this because it could be just having a caring person be near you and focus on you is healing. What have you seen about Reiki healing, where they've been initiated, they're sending out Reiki, and people who just pretend to do the sham healing? Yes,
and in fact, that's another study that I actually have in my chapter on Reiki healing that I thought was very powerful. And what this woman did is she was looking at people that had high anxiety or depression. So that was, they had these emotional problems, and she brought them in, and she had two control groups. And she told people, I'm not going to tell you which group you're in, but you're in one of these three groups. And she did not only Reiki that was hands-on, but she also did distance Reiki as one of the groups. And then she had a group that I believe, well, then she had the control group where she wasn't doing anything, but they didn't know whether they were getting distance Reiki or hands-on Reiki. And what she found is that both the hands-on and the distance Reiki were significantly more effective in improving the depression and the anxiety scores on all of her patients compared to the control group. But of course, the patients didn't know with the distance Reiki, but they were actually improved. So that's the beautiful example of they're getting help from this person. They think they're getting it or not, and yet we see those improvements. So her name was Adina Goldman Shore, I believe, and I loved it. I loved it because she had the quantitative evidence, and then she wrote a second article, which you often don't see in scientific journals, which was on what the people had to say about their experience of the healing. And many of these people wrote, I was skeptical about doing this energy healing, but literally I could feel the energy going into me, and I could feel the sense of something truly happening. And they said I was just absolutely amazed by it. And so she gave example after example of the people actually having a perception of this healing as well, meaning that we have perceptual abilities that are beyond the usual five senses as well in terms of many of us in receiving energy healing.
Do you remember if there were differences between the distance healing and the right face-to-face kind of healing?
I believe there were not. I believe they were exactly the same. But again, I imagine if you were to go to that chapter in my book or to just type in her name on the web and look at the article, I think she probably gives you the exact data on that.
Interesting. And then what do you think is happening with Tai Chi? Because it's not like Reiki where someone is directing healing energy at you. Why is that impactful?
Well, and that's interesting. So first of all, I should say that I've done a number of studies myself on Tai Chi and then looked at the other literature on Tai Chi. And I'll first tell you about the studies from my own laboratory. We started out doing this in the conservative way of simply saying, can Tai Chi improve balance abilities in older adults that are beginning to fall and have real problems? Because that's a typical problem in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And we actually measured the neuromuscular responses of the people when they're being thrown off balance and recovering their balance before Tai Chi training and then after I think it was maybe a 12-week period of Tai Chi training. And what we found is that the neuromuscular responses were much better organized afterwards, and the people were much better able to recover their balance. Okay, that's sort of just the bottom line. Yes, it changes the body. It's now more effective in movement.
It's
but
physiological.
Then we did a study. What?
It's physiological. I mean,
it's physiological.
It's a physiological correlation.
Right. And then the second study was the one that I was talking about where we had meditators and Tai Chi long-term practitioners comparing them to aerobic walkers and looking at their attentional abilities, because we know that aerobic walking brings more blood to your brain, therefore you have better attention afterwards. And so I wanted to know, is meditation and is Tai Chi any better than just something that brings more blood to your brain? And once again, we found that those people that practice Tai Chi and meditation were much, much better at attending to a light coming on the computer at random moments in time, and their event-related potential and their EEG, which is the point in their EEG when they see a light come on, the amplitude of that signal was about twice as large as sedentary adults, and the aerobic walkers were halfway in between. So we could see again physiologically that they were attending much, much better. And in fact, they had more activity in this anterior cingulate cortex and prefrontal cortex, which seemed to be key areas related to meditation. So then getting back to your question, well, what is Tai Chi doing? Well, I see Tai Chi as moving meditation.
Oh.
So what people are doing in Tai Chi is they are doing these movements, but when you watch a real master of Tai Chi, their movements are so slow and controlled. I mean, it's like this beautiful dance, and you begin to see that their mind is absolutely still as they are making these movements. So I'm beginning to think that, in fact, there's not a lot of difference between meditation, sitting meditation, and the moving meditation of Tai Chi. And that's why we see that. And literally, in Tai Chi, they talk about being the Chi energy. In meditation, we talk about either the Chi energy or the Ki energy or the Kundalini energy, meaning that meditators and Tai Chi practitioners feel this energy moving in their body in various places. And though it's not part of the five senses per se, they have a sense that there's something more going on in their meditation or in their Tai Chi practice.
So what's the correlation between consciousness and Chi? Or Ki, Prana, Mana, whatever we want to call it.
Yeah, right, all of those terms. I think that's a really good question, and I think it is subtle, and it's partly dependent on the tradition that you're looking at, because the different traditions call it Chi or Ki or Prana or Kundalini or Shakti. Those are all different names for it. And I think often they are talking about different aspects of consciousness. So, for example, I know that very often in the Indian tradition, they talk about prana as being this energy that is spread throughout the universe. And it's also, prana is what we're breathing in when we breathe in and when we breathe out. But they talk about the Kundalini energy or the Shakti as being this energy that can be awakened in us through meditation. And that energy then, once it is awakened from its dormant state in the human body, begins to give us mystical experiences and makes us feel this energy moving in different parts of our body, and perhaps gives us abilities that might be considered healing abilities, something like that. And I should say, from my own experience now as a neuroscientist, materialist who then started meditating, is that first experience in meditation was of energy in my heart, spreading through my body. And then when I began meditating at home, I began feeling energy between my eyes, at the crown of my head. And I knew nothing about chakras and energy fields when I was first meditating. I was a neuroscientist. And then I began to read. It's like, oh, there are these places that they talk about energy moving in your body. So I think that because those are universal experiences across traditions, we have to give some credence to the idea that there may be some energy that can be awakened through spiritual practices or spontaneously, and that those may give us a more subtle perceptual ability than we might have when that energy is more dormant inside of us.
So physiologically, in terms of the subtle anatomy, what would you say chakras, meridians, the aura, the energy fields outside of the body, what are they?
Right. And of course, a classical neuroscientist would say, don't even go there, because they're interested in the physical material world, and we have a hard time measuring this sort of thing with any normal neurophysiological instrument. Saying that, there are some people beginning to do research with things like Reiki, with acupuncture, with myofascial release, etc., that say that they can actually see changes in perhaps it's the conductance of the skin or the pathways or things like that when they are doing, for example, acupuncture. I don't know that literature well enough to say a lot about it, but I think what we're saying is that this energy is so subtle that most of the time we have a very difficult time measuring it with our usual physiological instruments. And yet, people who have these meditative abilities or have been practicing these things for a long time definitely see them, and you see this across traditions and across healing modalities. For example, so many people that practice Reiki say, oh yes, I see these energy centers and I see that one is out of balance, and that way I can go in there and balance it. That's not one of my own experiences. I can't do that, but I find it fascinating when I see somebody that's a healer that does that, and they have incredible healing abilities.
Well, Kirlian photography can show us the chakra centers and the meridians and the fields of the aura, so it can be photographed.
Well, and you say that, and some people say, oh, that's nothing, that those are changes in the conductance of the skin. So you always have the believers and you have the skeptics. And so whenever I talk about any of those things, I just try to remind myself that if you're a materialist neuroscientist, you'll say, excuse me, that's not real. And if you're somebody that has actually looked at it and you can actually say, oh, that photography looks like what I see because I'm a person that can see auras, then to you, that seems very valid. So that's why I try to put two hats on when I'm talking and giving an interview about these sorts of things, because the neuroscience hat will say, excuse me, no, but the other hat said, hey, from my own personal experience, this really seems valid.
You talk about hypnosis, that it changes what's going on in the brain. There's different effects on the ACC or the Somatosensory Cortex. How does that work?
So again, that's the other thing, that I first discovered that power of hypnosis by reading Irreducible Mind, and Ed Kelly and his colleagues have a beautiful chapter that includes a lot of work on hypnosis. And what was amazing about hypnosis was that when people who are highly suggestible, and that's the difference with hypnosis, you have various levels of hypnotizability. But if you are on the range where you're highly suggestible, highly hypnotizable, they could take, the hypnotherapist can take cold scissors and put them on the person's back and say these have just been on like hot coals, and that person will have the image of the scissors burnt onto their back. So their mind did that to their skin. And the other examples are things where they tell certain people, I am putting onto your skin a tree to which you are highly allergic to. Some trees have a resin in the leaves that people get an allergic reaction, and they don't put that one on. They put one that they're not allergic to, but then the allergic one gives the effect, and the non-allergic one, on the other hand, get reversed. So you're thinking, once again, it is my mind, my consciousness, separate from my brain, because the hypnotherapist can't explain how just saying something to the person can literally go straight to the brain without going through consciousness and beliefs that are created. Those beliefs can then change your neurons and change your physiology of your skin or whatever. So that's powerful. And I think it was powerful, again, to see that when some people looked at this, they found that, again, the anterior cingulate cortex and also the somatosensory cortex were two areas that they saw being more active in certain situations under hypnosis. So once again, I'm thinking it's interesting that certain areas seem to be common across a number of different types of healing modalities. Whether it's placebo or hypnosis or energy healing, etc., I don't yet know what that means, because I do not yet, and I don't know research that's actually out there that says, how is my mind actually interacting with my neurons in my brain? Where are those connections really occurring? Is it happening everywhere at once? Is it happening in certain centers? I don't think we know the answers, but I think those are fascinating questions.
What is the ACC's job? What does it do in the brain?
The anterior cingulate cortex is an interesting part of the brain that does a number of things. It's part of what I would call the executive attention network. So it's the part of the brain that helps us regulate our emotions in very good ways. And there's a wonderful study that I heard Mike Posner talk about, where they looked at the anterior cingulate cortex size in children that are about 4 or 5 years of age. And they noted that there was a direct correlation between the size of the anterior cingulate cortex and the children's ability to self-regulate. In other words, to keep from doing activities that would be impulsive. And they noted also that the size of the anterior cingulate cortex at about 4 to 5 years of age was also correlated with the success of these children later in life. And this included their health, their level of income, their success in the world, and also their level of criminality. So literally, that's all related to emotional regulation, size of the anterior cingulate cortex, and the beauty, of course, is that the size of the anterior cingulate cortex is modifiable through meditation. It can get larger through practicing meditation. So once again, that's a beautiful reason for offering students in the public school system meditation early on, like they're doing in Richard Davidson's projects that he's involved in.
Well, Davidson is involved with school children?
Yes, in fact, preschool and young school children, and they have a whole, I think, institute that's beginning to work on that, and I know they have articles that are already out.
Interesting. So what does the somatosensory cortex do? What's its job?
Yeah, the somatosensory cortex is really just the area of the brain that actually is registering what we're feeling on our skin or in other parts of our brain. So somato means basically your body. So it's the sensory part of your cortex related to your body. So basically the point is it is telling me that, oh yes, somebody has just pricked my skin, or I feel heat or cold on my skin. And so when you see that that is, for example, turned off under certain conditions, it means that you have inhibited the pathways going to that cortex so that now you aren't perceiving them at that particular moment in time.
So why might that be involved in psi phenomena? Because you're freed in some ways from sensing the body?
Well, when you say that, I don't know the specific study you would be talking about. There are different ways that it could be. So here's my prediction or my hypothesis. One is that if you are actually giving the person a placebo, or you're hypnotizing them and you're telling them that now you will not feel anything on your right arm, then we could imagine that the sensory pathways could be inhibited on the way up to the somatosensory cortex, and so it would be more quiet. Now, it could also be that if you have a paranormal ability related to sensation, for example, and you feel something, that maybe somehow your mind, through that paranormal sensation, if I want to call it a paranormal sensation, an intuitive sensation, is actually activating or registering in your somatosensory cortex, so that that is giving you the sensation. I say that because I know that I have heard from people who are mediums. I don't know a lot about mediumship. I haven't done a lot of research, but they have said that when they're talking to somebody about their relative on the other side, and the relative on the other side is telling them how they died, if they died from a heart attack, the person often feels the pain in their heart. Now, I don't know if that is that they're feeling a pain in the somatosensory cortex area related to their heart, and that's giving them that hint that that could be how the person died. Those are all speculative ideas, really, right now.
The pineal gland is pointed to by some people who do clairvoyant work, and they say that clairvoyance has to do with your pineal gland. Have you heard that one?
I have certainly heard it, and I don't know enough about the pineal gland. I know that was a popular hypothesis way back, even like in the 1800s, but I don't know now about, I haven't looked at research to see if that's still being upheld or not. I think that's a very interesting area, though.
All I know is pineal is connected to thyroid and regulates hormones.
Yes. Yeah, so it could be important. I have no idea.
Interesting. In the Berkeley Psychic Institute tools where I was trained, they really emphasized the pineal and therefore the sixth chakra. And they also emphasized eating chocolate. That the healers, the readers should renew themselves with chocolate. So I wonder if there's some kind of correlation of pineal and chocolate, whatever's in the chemistry in that.
I think that's very humorous. I love that. I think it's because certainly I love dark chocolate especially. And thinking about that, I will now up my intake of chocolate each day, trying to keep it within moderate ranges.
The Buddha taught us that, moderation in all things.
That's right.
Let's see. Oh, you also mentioned that you were presented with the possibility of miracles and angels, and what did you conclude about them? What's possible there?
Well, and so this is an interesting thing. I was asked by a magazine, I think it was Awareness Magazine, if I would be willing to write an article on angels. And I thought about it, and I said, well, I myself have not experienced an angel per se, but when I have looked carefully at the near-death experience research, I was amazed at how many times the person who then is under cardiac arrest, they have left their body, they're in another realm, they see spirits on the other side that are often these beings that appear to be clothed in light. And they say that these are often very benevolent beings that are welcoming them, that are full of love, unconditional love. And they say that it felt like this person clearly was only interested in their best interests. And usually those people then say to them, it's not your time, you need to go back, you have more to do in this world, and they go back. So hearing that person sounds a lot like the angels that some people may describe themselves when they're on this earth, and they might have a vision of someone, whether it's in a dream, or young children at night say, I saw this being of light that came to the bottom of my bed, and was simply standing there, but obviously full of compassion and love. So my own sense is that the experiences from NDEs point into people being able to perceive in some states beings of light that are very benevolent, and then hearing people who have more paranormal abilities saying that sometimes they have those experiences as well, makes me think that maybe it's just that many of us don't have those subtle perceptual abilities, but those beings may be around us.
Because our brain is filtering it out.
Exactly, our brain is filtering it out.
Gary Schwartz had an angel named Sophia present herself to him. He was surprised, I think. Yeah. And miracles are just things that happen that don't fit the scientific paradigm.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And it's just that our materialist paradigm that we have about certain laws that we think can't be broken, when it gets broken, we then say it couldn't have happened as the usual thing. And therefore we have to throw out that particular bit of evidence rather than saying, maybe we should reconsider our paradigm and make allowances for these things which clearly appear to happen and often have many, many witnesses at the same time watching something that appears to be impossible. Yes.
You mentioned Vedanta, and I know in Autobiography of a Yogi, Yogananda talks about his teachers. People will see them at the same time in different places, so that they can manifest their bodies here and there. So that book is filled with miracles.
Exactly. Yes. And again, it's a miracle if you have a materialist framework. And if you don't have a materialist framework, it's like, oh, of course that can be done. And people with subtle enough perception can perceive it, whereas others can't. So sort of interesting which, again, hat we put on as to how we interpret it.
And you also suggest that the scientific method now disparages first-person experiences because everything has to be objective, in quotes, and observable by a third person. But do you see any movement towards that there is more, look at, I have dissociative identity disorder and this alter doesn't have this disease and that one? I mean, that's profound to me.
Yeah, it is profound. And I think that the question here is, how do we use the first person perspective? I think in the past, the materialists really only wanted to accept data where you had physiological parameters. So whether it was, a change in the EEG or other sort of physiological phenomena, and saying, okay, this tells me that this person has changed in one way or another. But in fact, why not take the first person perspective, which is that person's experience along with the physiological data? And the example that I give is the near-death experiences. So we have the physiological data that their heart was stopped and they had a flat EEG.
Yeah.
And we now know with many of them at exactly that time, they were perceiving what was going on in the operating room from above their bed. Now, to me, then, first person wedded with third person gives me a whole new understanding of what is going on. First person by itself isn't enough. Third person isn't enough by itself. But combined, it is really powerful. So I think that's my challenge to the scientific community, is to actually include both of them when people are doing research from now on in these areas where we're looking at mystical experiences or consciousness being primary.
Right. It's like all those hundreds of accounts of children with birthmarks that were replicated their death experience or remembered details of their past life that could be verified. So those are first person experiences, and what makes them powerful is the amount of them.
And the fact that they're wedded with the third person research that Ian Stevenson and his colleagues did very carefully to prove everything about the autopsy report of the previous person and all the details. So I think that's, again, the beauty that's combining those two together. Yes.
We better define consciousness. We've been throwing that around a lot. So how do you define it?
That's a really good point. And I think that I would define consciousness basically from the mystical perspective now, from the what I would call the William James perspective, thinking of him as the grandfather of modern psychology, as basically an infinite awareness, might be a beautiful word again, that basically is then contracting down to what I would call my individual awareness of all the individual human beings and perhaps animals within this world, and that we then are experiencing that infinite consciousness from a very small point of view. And then what happens, of course, is in a near-death experience or in what we might call a meditative experience, a mystical experience, we then take the filters off of our brain and we then begin to see consciousness from this broader perspective, where we have sort of a semi-permeable membrane between ourselves and our finite senses and this higher awareness that is out there available to us. And through the semi-permeable membrane, in a certain sense, we then can catch glimpses of, for example, the future, the past, other people's thoughts, what people are thinking, etc.
It's interesting that in some of the NDEs, the pet greets them as well. So it looks like animals retain their kind of personalities after they transition to the other side.
Exactly, and I think that that's a wonderful thing that when I was a young neuroscientist, I loved my pets. I loved them dearly, but I thought they were little machines with little tiny brains. And I limited my interaction with them because I think I thought that. And now that I see them now as spirits that are embodied, but that they also may have this ability to actually communicate in ways other than my neuroscience brain would think. I find that I interact with them in a much closer way, and we have a much more intimate contact in a certain sense, and friendship between the animal and myself, as I give them more credit I give them credit for being more than just a little tiny brain inside of the cat body or whatever. So.
It's like Rupert Sheldrake studies of the dogs that knew when their people were coming home, even if it wasn't at a regular time. So they were good ESP practitioners. In terms of consciousness, you've looked at Kashmir Shaivism, the Shiva Sutras. What particular insights did you get from that?
Well, I think what I found was interesting is that when you look at those people that were writing these, like the Shiva Sutras and the Pratyabhya-Hridayam, these Kashmir Shaivite texts, they were writing them in like maybe the 10th century, the 11th, the 12th century. So this is a long time ago. And yet the way they describe consciousness sounds so much like what we are now beginning to learn about it in the present day. And I think that there are like some verses that I just really loved when I began looking at them and looking at the original Sanskrit. And I think one of them that I loved was saying something like that consciousness, out of its own freedom, is the source and the power of everything. So I love the idea that they were thinking of consciousness in this infinite way, that it's primary, it's fundamental, and it in its own freedom then contracts itself down into all of the individual entities of this world. So that relates to some of the things we've already talked about so far with some of the ideas about our modern research. And the filter that happens then when you contract down, you put filters on your perception so that you only see in a limited way. And I think one of the other ones I loved is that basically the idea that consciousness itself descends from that expanded state to become the mind, contracted according to the objects that it perceives. And so once again, they're saying this, 1,000 or more years ago. And here we're talking about the same sort of thing, consciousness contracting to the individual minds, filtering out a broader reality. And then also another one from the Shiva Sutras, which is another one of those ancient texts, which simply says, your own innermost self is consciousness. And that is Chaitanya Atma. It's saying your highest self, your inner self, is truly consciousness. And I think we're again hearing more and more scientists beginning to say, oh yes, we might say it slightly differently in our modern times, but we're saying the same sort of thing. So I was really struck by this ancient wisdom. And I think what I'm learning is that what they often say about spirituality is that you practice a particular point of view on the world in order to actually expand and take on that point of view of the world. And I think in Kashmir Shaivism, you practice the sadhana of Shiva to become Shiva. You practice the spiritual practices of absolute infinite consciousness to become that infinite consciousness. So it's a matter of, in every waking moment of your day, remembering I am interconnected with everyone else in this world, with everything else in this world. And then we have this broader perspective where we treat other people with much more respect. We treat our planet with respect, the animals with respect. And so that's been sort of a joyful practice for me, is to practice that unity awareness and then live it more fully.
Mm-hmm. And my picture from those traditions is then the goal is consciousness breaks, it separates, but then the goal is to come back to unity. So
exactly.
And it's kind of like Adam and Eve leaving the Garden of Eden to gain consciousness, and then they can come back. I'm really interested in courses that are being taught in consciousness studies or paranormal or parapsychology or transpersonal psychology. And did you teach one at University of Oregon?
Well, when I taught the course in alternative and complementary medicine, definitely I was bringing all of that into it. And what was so fascinating is I was teaching pre-med majors. So these were people that were going on to be doctors, nurses, physical therapists, etc. And they were seniors. And what I was doing was saying, okay, you know about traditional medicine, and you're going to go on to perhaps study that, but I'm going to tell you now about complementary medicine, and I'm going to challenge you to write 2 papers during the term where you go in and look at the literature on one modality or another. It could be energy healing, it could be acupuncture, it could be meditation, and what I want you to do is actually see what evidence there is for whether this is efficacious or not efficacious in making you a more healthy, whole person, and including in curing diseases, etc. And what happened is by the end of that term, and they're writing 2 papers on 2 different modalities, a number of the students decided to change their career focus slightly to, for example, go into naturopathic medicine or osteopathic medicine or something like that that allows them to actually use both traditional medicine and some of these complementary forms of medicine on their patients because they saw that was a better way of healing.
Now that you're not at U of O, is it still being taught, that course?
It is not, and that's because they don't quite have the right professor on the faculty to do that. I was one of the few in my department that was truly focused on both sides of things.
Do you know of other places besides UVA's Perceptual Studies program that offer courses?
Yes, I think in many of these universities, there are courses that are related, for example, to meditation and the mind. And I know, for example, that like at Emory University, they have a contemplative studies program. At Brown University, they have a contemplative studies program. And I think that type of a program is becoming much more available at universities around the country right now for undergraduates. And in some of those contemplative studies programs, they have some neuroscientists and they have some people from religious studies or Asian studies, and they are carrying on dialogues between them. So I think that would probably be another great place for students to look if they were interested in going into this in more depth.
And then it seems like there are more med schools that are offering holistic programs or whatever they call them.
Right, and I was fascinated when I showed my students that if you simply type in Harvard University, Stanford University Medical School, Yale University Medical School, they're teaching acupuncture, they're teaching energy healing, etc. And I said, see, it's like you are skeptical, but these major university medical schools, the cream of the crop, are now offering this to physicians, often in their program or as a continuing education for physicians to come back and retrain and take this. So that was very powerful.
Mm-hmm. Do you have another book in the offing?
I do, and I'm just beginning to start thinking about it. And if I'm to write another book, I'm thinking that it will be on what Bruce Grayson would call, and I like this term, the bioenergy that drives human evolution. And what I mean by the bioenergy that drives human evolution is that energy that is awakened during a near-death experience or is awakened during a spiritual experience or a cosmic consciousness experience, which we also might call the Kundalini Energy, and talk about, from a scientific point of view, what is really going on that awakens something in us to subtler perceptual abilities, and what does that mean in terms of human evolution, both within that person during their lifetime, but then also within all of us across the years.
Are you involved with Chi, the group that was started by Dr. Jang?
No, I'm not.
They study the biofield, and
wow.
You'll want to know them.
Yeah.
I'll send you a link.
Great.
I wanted to ask you about the broader sociological picture, knowing what you know about the mind. Do you have optimism or pessimism in the face of what we're seeing now of climate change, the autocrats increasing around the world, growing inequality? What are your predictions?
Well, it's such an interesting question, because depending on the moment and who I'm talking to, one can feel reasonably optimistic because we see more and more researchers moving from a strict materialist perspective to really being interested in spirituality, and more of the lay public saying, when you ask them, do you believe in spirituality or life beyond death or whatever, you see more and more people saying yes, they do. So in that sense, it seems like maybe we are waking up in a certain sense. And at the same time, I think that when you look at the data from day to day, and you hear about climate change, and you hear about, war and things like that, the political climate, people get discouraged. And I hear people saying, well, I'm going to be sure that I'm not going to live in Florida where we may have everything underwater, and I'm moving to New Hampshire or something like that. And I'm thinking that makes this person sound really, really negative about his own concept of the future. Saying that, I still remember that there was a lecture that I heard at the University of Oregon by Steven Pinker, who was at Harvard University and MIT University, who actually did very careful studies looking at violence across history. And what Steven Pinker showed was that if you look at violence for the last 2,000 years, almost like since recorded history has been there, you can see that violence has been going down little by little by little all the way across history. And so he says, we don't feel like it's the case, but we're living in a much less violent climate now than we were 200, 500, 1,000 years ago or more. And I think that's what we often have to remember, that our news media basically reports violence. It doesn't report good things very often compared to violence. And violence has emotional stickiness in a certain sense. We remember emotionally negative things more than we remember emotionally positive things. So my intuition is that we aren't necessarily going, straight down toward a terrible, terrible end to our planet. At the same time, I say that's not going to keep me from trying my best to reduce climate change and to reduce violence and to spread the concepts that we hear in spirituality that help us see our planet and our human entities and our animal entities as one mass of sacred spirit, and we need to really respect each other. And the more we meditate and feel that unity, the more we respect each other, and then don't do the things that degrade our planet and our society.
Mm-hmm. What do you do for fun in the face of all that you're doing? Do you still play the cello?
I still play the cello and the oboe, and I play the oboe more than the cello because I actually am much better at the oboe since I played that since I was a child. But yes, so I still go to Berlin, where my best friend from childhood is the head of Stanford University's Study Center in Berlin, and take my oboe with me, and we play cello and oboe duets when I'm there.
Wonderful.
And so that is one way that I have fun. And I also love nature. And so in Eugene, Oregon, we live in nature in the beautiful northwest area, and down in Sedona, where now Paul and my husband and I are spending half of our time. Again, we're right next to the National Forest and can walk forever. And for me, nature and divinity seem to go hand in hand. My heart is uplifted and expanded every time I walk out in nature. So that is one of the ways. And I should say also, I find spiritual practices enjoyable. I mean, I find like quieting my mind enjoyable. I find singing spiritually oriented, like chants and things like that, enjoyable, and spending time with other people interested in this sort of thing. So I laugh that really most of my friends right now are intrigued by spiritual phenomena and intrigued by expanding their consciousness so that they feel that sense of joy and connection with everyone else in the world. And that makes me, of course, then also feel very uplifted. So in many ways, those are my relaxing things that I do.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you think that we should include, that we've left out?
I think you've done an incredible job of covering all of the bases, so thank you, Gail.
Could you show us the snow again? Because
definitely.
For people like California, like me, it's like, whoa, this is a treat.
Yes, I think we probably have a good 8 inches by now. There should be a beautiful red rock out there, but it's covered by the snow.
Oh, my.
So there you are.
Oh, my goodness.
The winter wonderland of Sedona, which you rarely see with this much snow.
Yes. Oh.
Yeah, so and there's more out here. So there you go.
Thank you.